Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's today's guest host, Michelle Dover.
Thank you, Dal. Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Press the Button. I'm Michelle Dover, Director of Programs here at Ploughshares Fund, and I will be hosting Press the Button while Joe is taking some well-deserved time off out of the office. We have a lot to cover today, including news out of Iran, news about the failure to save arms control, and as well as some topics of discussion here in the U.S. We'll be discussing these issues and more with Deputy Director of Policy Mary Kaszynski and our Roger L. Hale Fellow Catherine Killough on our early warning segment. After that, you'll hear a recent sit-down that Joe had with Congressman Anthony Brown, Vice Chair of the House Armed Services Committee, to discuss the latest developments with Iran and congressional action aimed at halting the drift towards yet another war in the Middle East. As always, if you like what you hear, please remember to comment, share, subscribe, and rate. We always love to hear from you, our listeners, and it really helps us out. But first, the news.
And now,
Early warning. Early warning. Early warning. Early warning.
a 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm here with our Deputy Director of Policy, Mary Kaszynski, and our Hale Fellow Catherine Killough. Thank you, ladies, for joining me for what I am sure will be another intense 7 minutes. Let's get started. Mary, in the Middle East, Iran announced this weekend it has begun enriching uranium above the levels agreed upon in the 2015 nuclear deal. What does this mean?
Well, frankly, from a non-proliferation standpoint, this isn't enormously dangerous. It's very clearly a message that Iran is sending. They said 60 days ago that they're going to start rolling back their compliance with the nuclear agreement. They laid out a couple of steps that they might take, and in fact, they have taken another step that is a breach of the nuclear agreement, but it's a relatively minor one. They're enriching past the limits set by the nuclear accord. What's really interesting here is that, first, the Europeans haven't responded as they could have by snapping back all of the UN sanctions. Instead, they're continuing to talk to Iran. They're trying to put together some economic benefits that might convince Iran to come back into compliance with the accord. The second really interesting thing is that Iran has set another 60-day clock. They might take additional steps that would be more dangerous, steps that are, again, breaches of the nuclear agreement if they don't see some economic benefits very soon.
So it sounds like over the next 2 years, we're about to enter a period of 60-day clocks.
One 60-day clock after another, 60 days and then another 60 days, and the slow unraveling, potentially, of the nuclear agreement. It's still alive, though, and I think that's really important to keep in mind.
No, and I think I had a question about that because from the way you've described it, clearly Iran is laying out a path of if they're going to become further and further out of compliance with the deal, this is the timeline and these are the steps. And these seem to be aimed primarily at the Europeans to try to give Iran the benefits that it was supposed to get under the deal. But in the meantime, you have, last month we saw the escalation in tensions with the U.S. So if Iran is aiming these actions primarily at Europe, what does this mean for you? What do you expect to see in terms of the U.S.'s actions?
Perspective. Yeah, that's a really good question. So Iran is clearly sending a message to the Europeans, Russians, and the Chinese that if they don't come up with some economic benefits, that Iran, will continue to escalate. On the one hand, that's great because this is clearly a message, not a threat. This is not a sprint to a bomb. It's a message to try to leverage some economic relief from the other parties to the agreement, and they're all still in compliance. Here's the bad news. This cycle of escalation, Iran is clearly responding to some of the provocations on the U.S. side. Those provocations were started by the Trump administration when they violated the nuclear agreement a year ago. And those provocations are continuing because they're being driven by those in the administration, particularly John Bolton, who clearly want a war with Iran, and they're looking for an excuse. And Iran continuing to reduce their compliance with the agreement, Iran ramping up their nuclear activities, could be the excuse that Bolton and others are looking for to start a war.
Yikes. And do we expect to see any responses, any breaks in escalatory tendencies in the U.S.?
The good news is that some in Congress are starting to rein in the Trump administration and their relentless drive for war. Congressman Anthony Brown, in particular, has been a leader on this. He, along with Representatives Ro Khanna, Representatives Matt Gaetz, and about 50 other members of the House, have introduced an amendment that might be coming up for a vote very soon that would block the administration's ability to launch military strikes against Iran. So fortunately, Congress is stepping up and starting to put a brake on this drive for war that we're seeing from the administration.
Awesome. And listeners will be able to hear from Congressman Brown later in this episode as well. So speaking of arms control and nonproliferation accords that are, on life support, Catherine, you've been following what appears to be the long, slow demise of the INF Treaty.
Yes, and I'm afraid that it's been taken out of life support and it may be finally dead. Last week, President Putin signed a bill that formalizes Russia's departure from the INF Treaty. And this comes after the Trump administration had announced its withdrawal in February. So it was pretty dead. Now it's quite dead. And on August 2nd, it will be really very dead.
So wait, what happens on August 2nd?
August 2nd is when the U.S. will formally withdraw from the treaty.
So with the INF Treaty dead, what does this mean for, the arms race that we've been talking about, or arms control more generally?
Well, it raises real urgent concerns about how we are going to prevent the buildup of these intermediate range missiles and all the dangers that come with that buildup. And I think for arms control writ large, we're going to be looking to the New START talks, if they ever happen. And I honestly can't say with any positivity that they will.
Zombie arms control agreements. I think that's what we're really looking at here, guys. I mean, the Iran deal, INF, New START, who knows what's next, but it could be pretty cool.
Well, on that optimistic note, we're going to change our focus slightly from the international to the domestic. A lot of times what we, talk about on this are what the U.S. relationships are with other countries or what's going on, in the rest of the world. But Catherine, you've been following a story that's a little bit closer to home.
Yeah, there was a really fascinating AP News feature on this forum that took place on the 4th of July at Aiken County, South Carolina. There's a new mandate by the Department of Energy to start making 50 plutonium pits a year at their Savannah River Site. Now, these plutonium pits serve as nuclear weapons core. And the argument is that our existing plutonium stockpile is aging, and so they need to be replaced. This would cost an estimated $5 billion because they don't currently have the facilities to create.
I was going to say, I didn't think Savannah River was set up for this.
It's not. But besides the cost, there are real concerns here that some of the environmentalists and local community leaders were raising at this forum. First is, the health risks associated with working with plutonium. And then there are concerns about the real motives behind DOE's proposal. Do they really see a need to refresh our plutonium stockpile, or is this a justification for creating new nuclear weapons.
Well, with that, we're going to have to continue this conversation on another early warning since our 7 minutes are up. Thank you, Catherine and Mary, for joining me.
Congressman Brown, thank you so much for welcoming us to your Longworth House office building.
Joe, thanks for coming by. Looking forward to the discussion about important issues around the globe and how it's impacting, the United States and our role. So thanks for coming over.
It's great. Well, I love this building. I worked here for 6.5 years when I was on the staff of the House Armed Services Committee, the committee you're now on.
Yeah.
So it's a pleasure to sort of come back to my old stomping grounds. So I thought I'd start with just a few questions about you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
You represent the 4th District of Maryland. Tell us a little bit about that district.
Well, first of all, it's a great district, and it's a privilege.
They all are great
They're
districts.
all great districts. No member of Congress will ever say anything else. No, it's a district that I'm very familiar with. I represented this district, parts of Prince George's County, parts of Anne Arundel County in Maryland. I represented it when I was in the Maryland House of Delegates, a district within Prince George's County as lieutenant governor, sort of representing and working on behalf of the entire state. But I couldn't have asked for two better counties to represent Anne Arundel, a little bit more conservative community, Prince George's County, about 65% African American. And it's a fairly solid blue district.
Yes. And you have quite a storied career. You're first generation immigrant, like my parents were.
Yep. My parents came to this country. My father out of poverty in Kingston, Jamaica. He was raised by his grandmother in a 1-bedroom home, and when he was probably in his late teens, he wrote a letter to my grandmother, his mother, who was already in the United States, and said, "Hey, Mom, bring me to America. I want to go to school and one day be a doctor." He grew up in a community where he saw a lot of illness and disease. Much of it, went untreated, and so he wanted to do something about it as he grew older. So she didn't have a whole lot of money, but she saved what little she did. She brought him to this country, and he went to college, and then went to Switzerland on a scholarship to go to medical school, and that's where he met my mother. Yeah.
Well, and you just rocketed through the ranks. Do I understand this correctly? You were very successful in high school, then were admitted to West Point, transferred over to Harvard, and then served in the U.S. Army for 5 years of active duty. Is that right?
Yeah. I've had
not too many graduates of Harvard go into the Army.
No, not. In fact, at that time, back in 1984. ROTC wasn't so well received on the campus. We were, Harvard was one of those campuses, like so many in the 1960s and 70s, that kicked ROTC off the campus.
I remember.
I would say today things have changed dramatically, and while there's not an ROTC unit at Harvard, it's a program in conjunction with MIT, but well supported and encouraged by the Harvard faculty and administration and the students. And I always felt comfortable putting my uniform on campus and going to MIT. My classmates, were always very supportive.
So after 5 years of active duty, you go to Harvard Law School, and then elected to the House of Delegates in Maryland, then lieutenant governor, now the House of Representatives. I understand at Harvard Law you went there with Barack Obama.
He was a year ahead of me.
So do you feel like you're underperforming?
Well, I'll tell you what. He was the editor, the president, I guess, of the Law Review, first African American to hold that position. I was a proud backbencher. But no, we were very fond of Barack back then. It was clear that he was going to be doing something great in his life. Maybe a Supreme Court justice, and
who knew?
Which is not completely out of the question. He's a young man. He's a young man. Maybe in a Biden administration. But I haven't endorsed, and I'm not endorsing now, a presidential candidate. But no, we were fond of him. It clearly stood out for his intellect, his interpersonal skills.
And you're still in the Army Reserves, right?
Well, no. I was in the reserves for up, at the 30-year mark is when you hit your MRD.
30
That's your mandatory
years.
removal date.
So you retired as a colonel?
Colonel, yeah, in 06, I was able to command.
So what do people call you? Congressman, Colonel, Governor, Lieutenant Governor?
You know, I mean, right now, obviously Congressman,
Yes.
but some of my colleagues in the House do call me Colonel.
Oh, right.
I think when I retire, little known fact, when you retire as a military officer, you have to attain the rank of Colonel to kind of use it on stationary or as a title. That's protocol. Not everybody follows it. So I'm just debating whether in retirement they call me Congressman, Lieutenant Governor, or Colonel. I like Colonel.
You're still a relatively young man. Let's see what other titles you can
let's
acquire.
Let's not talk about retirement either.
So let's turn to the issues that have brought us together here, which is the situation in Iran. You put out a press release just a few days ago that said President Trump has deliberately and recklessly set us down the path toward conflict with Iran and risks stumbling into another war in the Middle East. Could you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, look, I'm really concerned about the approach that this administration has taken. I mean, starting with the JCPOA, right, as you know, we call it the Iran nuclear deal. And regardless, I wasn't in Congress when that deal was struck. And regardless of how you feel about that deal, and there's a lot of debate and disagreement over that, it was a deal, and it was a multilateral deal, and not as imperfect as it may have been. But for the president to withdraw the United States from that deal, and then to begin ratcheting up the tension around it, I think, brings us closer to conflict with Iran. Ratchet up the sanctions. Let me clearly state, Iran is a bad actor. And the malign activities in the region, their ballistic missile program, their arms sales to terrorist groups needs to be addressed. And I'm all for a conversation and with our allies and partners to sanction that behavior. But I thought it was the wrong strategy to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal because you were concerned about other issues unrelated to the Iran nuclear deal.
Right. Issues that the deal was never intended to address.
Absolutely. So, but this is the modus operandi of this administration. I mean, they pull out of multilateral agreements, and you can start with Paris Climate Accord, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which leaves us sort of, absent in the Indo-Pacific region. And the Iran nuclear deal, the threat of the INF, pulling out of the INF because of Russian noncompliance.
And lately, John Bolton talking about New START, the last remaining arms control treaty we have with the Russians, saying he might let that expire.
I think the better approach is you stay in these agreements, you speak forcefully about the problems, the challenges, the issues of noncompliance, and you address them, but you do it within the context of the agreement, even when the agreement may not be perfect. So he pulls out of the JCPOA, labels the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist group, and then escalates or ramps up our presence in the region while imposing sanctions that are squeezing about 70 or 80% of their economy. It happens in such a short period of time that the tensions are escalated, and then what we saw is a very chaotic decision making that almost led to really armed conflict with Iran.
Well, apparently we were within 10 minutes of attacking Iran last week. What did you think when you heard that last Thursday?
So a few thoughts and really emotions went through my mind and my body. I mean, I was relieved that a strike did not happen. I was alarmed at the chaotic nature, the dysfunctional nature of the decision-making process within the National Command Authority. But then on reflection, I actually stepped back and based on information and briefings that I've received, I think the president mischaracterized. And look, I spent 30 years in the Army active and reserve. I was an Army lawyer. And as an operational Army lawyer they are involved in decisions about targeting that are presented to a commander in the field, or in this case, to the President of the United States. And when targeting options are presented, there's some basic information that's always included. What's a target? Why? Okay, how are we going to target this? What are the effects that we're trying to achieve? And most importantly, what's the collateral damage?
Right.
Okay.
The standard part.
That's standard. So for the president to suggest that no one in the chain of command presented him with civilian casualty or the human toll of this strike is misleading. But I think he did it to hold himself out as some humanitarian. Like at the last minute, 10 minutes before the airstrike, I asked the general how many people will be killed. And when I heard 150, the benevolent President Trump called it off. It wasn't proportional. And I think he really mischaracterized what probably happened.
It's hard to say, but do you have any speculation about what you think actually did happen? Why he ordered and then suspended a strike?
Well, I won't speculate, but I will identify some things that could happen in any operation. The targeting conditions at the target could change.
Yes.
Conditions on sort of the strike package, right? I mean, you could have a maintenance failure en route. You could have it could be a scenario where you have a recovery aircraft that's in the area. You always have a recovery aircraft so that if a jet fighter goes down, you can recover that fighter. It could be a scenario where the recovery, it could be a maintenance issue.
So it could be operational issues that thwarted the attack rather than him calling Tucker Carlson and asking him what to do.
That's right. That's right.
So we for whatever reason, we dodged a bullet there.
Right, and I was relieved. When
because
you
think what do you think would then happen if we attack Iran? What do you think happens? How does this unfold?
Yeah, Iran is not Iraq, and Iraq was costly both in terms of human suffering, death, and injury to U.S. forces, to Iranian civilians, and it cost us a lot of money. I think that Iran would be more costly both in terms of human lives, human suffering, and the cost to the U.S. Treasury because of their capabilities.
A major new war.
Right.
This isn't a one. This isn't Syria.
That's right.
It's not a one-shot attack.
That's right. It's not 2 airstrikes because of the use of chemical weapons. I would suspect that if we strike in the sovereign territory of Iran and perhaps even Iranian assets outside of their sovereign territory, including their coastal waters, that it is likely that they would respond in turn. And then what do we do? And that's called escalation. Again, I mean, I always do want to come back to the fact that, Iran is a bad actor. There's no doubt about it, but we've got to be much more responsible in the way that we engage them. I believe in coercive diplomacy. I really do. I mean, if you've got hard power that can create the space so that your diplomats can engage and achieve results, I think that's an acceptable approach. The problem here, you've got a whole lot of coercion, but no diplomacy.
Yes.
That we have no diplomacy.
Right. What's the point of the pressure?
Right. What's the point of the pressure if you're not talking to them? So we have no military-to-military communications with Iran.
Right.
That's problematic. That's how you get into these miscalculations. What airspace are you in? Are you not in the airspace? The president, thought that, he announced that it was some rogue officer that ordered the drone.
Loose and stupid.
Loose and stupid.
I think was his
so the mill-to-mill communications are helpful, but the other piece is diplomatic. And if we're sanctioning, we're imposing sanctions on the Iranian foreign minister, it's not likely we're going to be sitting down in a diplomatic conversation with him. However, we have allies, and I would suggest European allies that could serve as our intermediaries, as mediators, as the go-between that can facilitate the kinds of conversations that have to happen, the communications between the United States and Iran.
Yes.
Some have offered. There's conversations that France could serve in a very useful role.
Yes.
So I think we need to be exploring that. Because you've got to get to a position where you're having the conversation so you can achieve the desired end state. If the desired end state is for Iran not to develop a nuclear capability, and that was what the whole purpose of the Iran nuclear deal was about. And if the desired end state is for Iran to modify, if not dismantle, their ballistic missile program, which I think is a big ask, but you could get there maybe incrementally, to discontinue selling and transferring arms to terrorists and other violent extremist groups in the region, to discontinue and to scale back their meddling and everything everything, everywhere from Lebanon to across the Levant and into the Arabian Peninsula, you got to have a conversation with them.
Yes.
And just escalating and ramping it up with a military presence isn't going to achieve that purpose.
So let's get to the issue that the Congress will be considering quite soon, and that brings us together, which is you decided to offer an amendment in the House Armed Services Committee as it was marking up the Defense Authorization Act that would restrict the president's ability to declare an unauthorized or begin an unauthorized war with Iran. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What concerns you there and what you were trying to do?
Sure. I mean, many of us in Congress are concerned about the overuse, right, if you will. Perhaps you could even say the misuse of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. That's the authorization that enabled us to go into Afghanistan in pursuit of al-Qaeda and now later the Taliban. And as it was written, it gives the authorization to essentially go after those groups that were responsible for the attack on the United States at 9/11. And affiliated groups. Well, that affiliated groups piece, that language has been broadly interpreted. So many of us, particularly after hearing Secretary Pompeo trying to make a connection between Iran and al-Qaeda, he mentioned that in a number of statements before the Senate, in the press. So many of us said, look, we need to put the brakes on that because the 2001 authorization no way could be considered to have contemplated a military action in or against Iran.
So their argument is that Iran is somehow operationally affiliated with al-Qaeda, the people who attacked us on 9/11. And this came up during the debate in the House authorization. I think it was Congresswoman Slotkin who said that in closed-door briefings, the administration had directly asserted this connection, and therefore that a war on Iran was covered under the 2001.
Sure, and I'm not going to confirm or deny anything in closed door.
That's why I quoted her.
But we know in open sources. That Secretary Pompeo has said that there is a connection between Iran and al Qaeda. And interestingly enough,
and is there anything that you've seen that supports that?
So I've had a number of classified briefings, and I'll just say that I certainly don't believe that there is enough information to be able to conclude that Iran is affiliated with al-Qaeda that would open up the possibility of the 2001 AUMF. And that's why we introduced the amendment.
Yes.
So, but it's important to emphasize that we haven't altered the president's constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. We haven't altered the Congress's powers under the Constitution to declare war, to authorize the use of military force. We haven't modified the War Powers Act. We haven't stripped the ability to protect treaty allies. We're just clarifying that you cannot spend funds in or against Iran, and you cannot rely on the 2001 AUMF.
So none of the funds authorized for the Defense Authorization Bill under your amendment could be used for a war
in or against Iran without congressional authority, and the 2001 AUMF is not that authority.
So in order for the president to, after this bill were to be passed and supposing it become law, which is a big if, the president would not be able to go to war with Iran without coming to Congress and asking for authorization, and that's the point.
That's the point. That's the point. Now, if U.S. territory, possessions, armed forces, or U.S. persons are attacked,
of course,
clearly we have the ability to respond to that. But an operation in and against Iran, initiating an armed conflict short of some of those exceptions that we just talked about, is not authorized under the 2001 AUMF.
So you're going to offer this amendment on the floor very soon as the House takes up the Defense Authorization
That's right,
Bill.
the week of July 8th.
I'm looking at the list of amendments, and this is quite an impressive list, beginning with the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, and the chairman of the Senate the House of
Foreign Affairs Committee,
Elliot Engel. And then it goes on and on and on from there. The head of the Rules Committee. You've done a lot of work on this.
Look, we've done a lot of work on this. We've worked with Democrats and a number of Republicans to get the language right, so that we're very clear. It's with surgical precision. that we've kind of tried to keep it narrow. 2001 AUMF, not available for Iran. Look, remember, there's a larger debate that's happening about repealing the 2001 AUMF altogether. Yes. That's not what this amendment is. That's an important debate to have. That amendment is on the appropriations bill, and whether or not that's successful, I don't know. But keep in mind that, and I don't know the exact number, but I think 70% of the current members of Congress were not in Congress when the 2001 AUMF was passed, and that number may even be higher. So we're overdue a debate on the authorization on the use of military force.
Yes, and you've been personally very involved in this, personally wrangling the votes, talking, buttonholing your colleagues. Why is it so important to you?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that we achieve the stated goal that we were talking about, but you got to get it right as well. And some of the language that I saw early on in the early drafts had a list of exceptions, introducing new ideas and concepts without full debate, and the language was not clear enough. The language was sort of altering, unintentionally perhaps, the how one could construe the War Powers Act, how and raises the question: are we altering the balance between the constitutional authority of the executive branch vis-a-vis the Congress? We're not trying to do that. Let's just have tight language, simple language, achieve the goal that I think has bipartisan. It does. It has bipartisan support, and I think we can get this into law. So keep it tight.
Yes.
Okay. Let's achieve our intended goals, and we can come back another day to argue, debate the larger issue of the authorization for the use of military force and its implications globally.
Yes. Yes. Well, that's the JAG in you.
Yeah.
That's the lawyer looking real tight. And how?
I didn't want this to be just a messaging bill. I didn't want or amendment. I didn't want it to be a sloppily. That's what a word, right? That was a sloppy word. I didn't want the amendment to be simply where some members could vote yes, only for it to go to the Senate and have no chance, or God forbid, a messy amendment gets put into law and then you really can't apply it because it's not well written.
So how do you play this out? What do you think if this amendment passes the House and is accepted in some form by the Senate in conference, and then the bill goes to the president to sign?
Yeah. Now the entire National Defense Authorization Act goes to the president. Does the president veto the Defense Authorization Act? Right. This $733 billion authorization, which funds readiness and modernization, a 3.1% increase for military pay, improvements on military housing, which is a quality of life issue, a host of other things. We're addressing a host of other things that are important to the president as well as to Congress. Does he veto that because of this AUMF provision? I think not. But he's a wild card in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We got a wild card.
When we get to that point several months down the road, we'll come back.
That's right.
And we'll talk to you.
Good. I look forward to that.
So the lawyer in you is very careful about the language, but I'm sitting in your office and I see a number of memorabilia from the Army, Army Strong, apparently headlines from your days as a helicopter pilot. And one of the other accomplishments I forgot to mention, do some of these things inform your passion about the issue of why you care so much about avoiding another unnecessary war? Can you tell us about some of these things?
Yeah, well, as you were looking around the room, you see, about a quarter century of memorabilia that reflects my time in the military. Beginning as a second lieutenant in aviation, flying in Germany, to when I was a colonel commanding a legal support organization as a military JAG. You see items that show my service in Iraq, going to airborne school at age 43. I knew I was crazy, and I convinced a lot of other people that I was as well. But you also see a plastic box over there in the corner, and what that box is, that was the receptacle that one of the many that was used in Iraq in January of 2005 that the Iraqis put their ballot in. And you remember, when we went to Iraq in 2003 and we toppled the Saddam Hussein regime, one of our goals was to get the Iraqis back to free and fair elections. And the very first one that they held was in January of 2005 when I was there.
I remember the excitement of those
And,
moments.
I recall seeing lines of Iraqis, men and women, standing on line, often in very dangerous conditions, because there were those who, obviously were against the U.S. occupation, had no interest in seeing a successful election. So voters were literally endangered standing on that line, which often measured 5, 6, 7 miles. And so they would stand on line, cast their ballot, put it in that plastic box, and then dip their finger in the indelible purple ink. And what a sight that was to see, as people proudly, Iraqis proudly raised their finger up. And it was indelible. It would last, maybe a week or so. And I worked with the Iraqis when I was when I was deployed, and for weeks they would come into the office and hold up that finger and with pride, and it was that part of my deployment where I said, wow, maybe we're doing something good here, but it was a difficult time to be in Iraq. It was 2004, 2005. We were taking, for every step forward, we were taking 2 or 3 steps backwards.
Did I read correctly? You were at Fallujah?
I'd been to Fallujah with the Marines. I deployed with the Army, but as an Army Civil Affairs officer and serving at that time as a senior advisor to the Ministry of Displacement and Migration. I went to Fallujah after the big offensive in November of 2004, and worked with the Marines and sort of trying to reestablish civil institutions, police departments and schools and things like that. We weren't so successful at that time because the war was still at a high intensity.
Yes. Well, Congressman, thank you so much for taking this time, and we wish you the best of luck with your amendment and with all your efforts to keep us from another unnecessary war. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.